welcome to Jane Savoy's Interviews with the Experts. I am your host, Chris Garrett, and today joining us is the founder of Tai Chi for the Equestrian and Ride from Within, Mr. James Shaw. Thank you for joining me today, James.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to give a little bit of background to our folks who are listening today on how I met you and some of the things you do. I had been just walking through an arena at an expo here in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain Horse Expo and heard you talking to one of the riders that you were explaining the biomechanics of how the horse and human interface, and you caught my ear, and I couldn't leave. I had to stop in my tracks, turn around, and stay for the rest of your clinic listening. Absolutely fascinating. You have such a unique way of explaining to a rider how that interface between horse and rider actually works, which is especially important to a dressage rider. And what I'd like to talk about today, because I know you have a million subjects you could talk about, is the rising trot and the sitting trot too. But if you could just explain through the work that you do, tell us about what you do, and let's talk about the biomechanics of the rider and how we can help our horse move better. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I would love to do that. The rising trot and the sitting trot are fascinating to me in the biomechanics piece of it and how little we really get taught the human side of it or the rider side of it. Usually it's dramatic and fantastic results in the horse due to the fact that the horse mirrors our body when we're riding, our tensions, our relaxations, and so it'll be immediately recognized in the horse when we do these small things in our body.
Well, that's what I noticed at that expo, is you had explained to the rider what you wanted her to do very specifically. She started to do it with the horse. It was an experienced rider. This isn't like horse training 101. It's an experienced dressage rider, and I saw such a huge difference in the horse and how the horse was able to move just by following your direction. Before we get too deep into that, though, let's talk about your book and your website, Ride From Within. And can you give us just a little background on you and what it is you do and how you got involved in this?
Sure. I started as a martial artist. I dedicated 20 years of my life to learning the Chinese martial art Kung Fu system. And within that system, we practice an internal art called Bagua. And the internal art just meant that there is more going on the inside than you could see on the outside. Basically, it's like Tai Chi, which we also studied, but it means that in this art, it means that you don't use force against force. You learn how to receive the power of the opponent, redirect it, neutralize it into the earth, and then by doing that, you can take advantage of the opponent without using force. So while I never think about the horse as an opponent, I do recognize that they are bigger, faster, and stronger than we are, and we will never get, no matter how much we work out, how much we go to the gym, we'll never get bigger, faster, and stronger than the horse. So we learn how to receive the power of the horse into our skeleton, and then by using the smallest muscles in the body to move our bones, we redirect that force through our body and back to the horse. And in doing so, the horse's body changes when our bodies change. So that's kind of how it, in a nutshell, if you will, what we do. We learn to borrow the power of the horse and redirect it rather than direct it from above, like sitting on top of that power and directing it from above. The how it works. I was introduced to dressage through my sister and her trainer and a series of clinicians that would come to Washington State and teach and train. And so in the beginning, I wasn't my idea that I would, this is going to be fantastic for the riding world, and I'll get to introduce a new paradigm to it. I thought, oh my God, what am I doing working with riders? I'm supposed to be teaching deadly Kung Fu to young men. And so that's how it started. I got tricked into it, I just happened to be working with a group of riders up here in Washington, and the following, they were thrilled about it, and they seemed to be overly enthusiastic, and I couldn't understand why, because I couldn't see the changes in the horse. My eye wasn't trained to see the movement in the horse in such a way. Their excitement led to getting me together with Betsy Steiner, and I worked with Betsy for a couple of years right in the beginning, and so that introduced me to upper-level dressage. So I started to see things and understand things and get an idea for the art of riding, not just the competitive side, but the true art in it. And it just, well, it sucked me right in. I started to see things in riders that I recognized from my own training, where I was using force and didn't think I was, or my timing was off, but I didn't have a sense of timing because I was so focused on the next movement. So in a sense, I wasn't present in the moment where everything would get exposed. I was just into the next movement, and I started recognizing the similarities. So it really sucked me right in, and it has been an amazing journey for the last 20 years, one that I thought I made a wrong turn, down the path when I found myself working with riders. So from that, to make a long story a little shorter, I was asked to publish a book by Trafalgar Square, and I did, and that has been an amazing process, and it's called Ride From Within. I'm working on a second book. The website is, I've had a website for a while, but this new one is under construction, and I'm really excited about it because we're going to offer a free video course, a free online course, if you will. At the end of that, if people are interested, there'll be a minimum cost online course available, and it's just going to give me a chance to show and say the things that I haven't been able to say in the past, just because of lack of exposure, and there was only one of me, and now I have a lot of good help.
One of the things I've really enjoyed about your work is how well it fits in perfectly with the work that Jane does, of course. It isn't, how do I say this, it's not riding instruction in the way that we think of as a trainer giving us riding instruction, but rather a training of how to move your body with the horse to achieve the things you already probably have learned from your trainer, but in a way that isn't using force and leverage. Like you said, that this idea of not using force against force, but using the movement of the horse with the movement of your body in such a way that it truly becomes the partnership, which for me personally, and I think for most dressage riders, that is the ultimate goal. And watching how quickly you were able to shift that for the riders at the expo was so intriguing. And I'd really like to ask for you to, I know it's hard to do because we don't have the visuals here, this is just an auditory recording, but could you share the mechanics of the human-horse interaction of energy in the rising trot and in the sitting trot and how that actually works? I don't think most people realize where that energy comes from and where it goes.
Absolutely, Chris. And in doing so, I will try to break it down into threes. For instance, in the rising trot, well, and let me preface with this. It takes practice to do this. We always talk about in Ride From Within, there's the principle that is the theory behind the application of an aid, let's say, or how we use our body. And so there's the first two are the principle and the application, and the third piece of the puzzle or the cycle is the ability. So quite often we understand the theory perfectly, we get the application and we're going to do it, and where we might lack a little bit is in the ability to do it, the actual ability of the body to do it not too much, not too little at the right timing. So that's just a heads up, because some of the things in the biomechanics, especially concerning the rider's seat, we need to train into. And mostly what we need to do is get rid of old habits of movement to refine and then introduce these new habits. So having said that, we can jump right into looking at the rising trot. And after the rising trot, we'll get the sitting trot. So in the rising trot, I want to address three main elements. First being timing. The second being the rider's position. Third being the weight aid, right, where our weight falls through our body into the horse to influence it. So in the rising trot, if we look at the timing, and in internal arts, they say timing is based on rhythm. So rhythm is the key to timing. Without timing, everything's kind of left to chance, or in the riding world, we could look at it as without precise timing, there's a gray area, for instance, where you're going to start the transition. You know, if you're transitioning into from walk to rising trot, and you're going to transition at C, there always seems to be preparation 2 or 3 strides ahead of time. The first timing that I look at, the 4 periods in the actual rising and sitting during the rising trot. So I break those down into the amount of time the rider's in the saddle, the time it takes to go from the saddle to the height of the post. I will call that the rising. I'll refer to that as rising. Mm-hmm. Then there should be that moment of suspension at the height of the rise, and the time it takes to come from the suspended state back to the saddle. So those 4 time periods are the time you're in the saddle, the time you're rising, the time you're in suspension, and the time you're sitting back to the saddle. The time that you're sitting and the time that you're suspended should be the same time frame, right? They should be the same time period. So I don't want to break it down into specific times because it's a little bit different and it's a little bit too mental. But say that you're sitting for 0.3 of a second, then you should be suspended for 0.3 of a second. Yeah, is that clear? And then the rising, the time you're coming up into the post and the time you're going back to the saddle, those 2 time periods should be the same. So I would suggest for our listeners that when one of the first things they want to do when they're just doing the rising trot is become aware of the timing. Be aware of how long they're in the saddle. Be aware of how long they're at the height of the post in suspension. Be aware of going up and coming down. And as best they can, try to make those equal, those time frames equal. Now, this is a challenge because the reason the timing is off usually is because we're not using our seat effectively. In other words, we are not utilizing the lift of the horse's power to move us out of the saddle into the post. And this is apparent in the fact that rising time period will be much quicker than the sitting period. And in fact, the rising, we have to use our legs to post rather than to initiate the post, to strengthen our quads, and we usually get that by leaning forward slightly in the saddle and pushing down in the stirrups. Mm-hmm. Now, the timing might be right, and I want to be clear that there's a difference between allowing the horse to lift you into the post, right, the initial lift out of the saddle, comes from receiving the power of the horse's hind end, usually the inside hind, to lift you into the post, and just using the push on the sit bone as a timing mechanism to then lean forward and push yourself into the post. So one is borrowing power. One is just using that power as like a button that gets pushed to tell you to post. And so that's going to take a little bit of time and experience to really feel the difference. So the timing of posting would be, we want to post as I'll call it the inside sit bone. And for this picture that we'll kind of try and paint on the radio, that we're on let's say a 20-meter circle to the left. So when the left thigh pushes into the earth, that power gets up through the horse's skeleton and starts to push into our left sit bone. That's the time that we pose. So most dressage riders would learn that in reverse, meaning that we would just start posting. And this is my experience in the beginning. I would just start posting, and then my instructor would ask me if I was on the correct diagonal. And I'd look down to the scapula of the horse and see if it was rising or dropping when I was posting, and then I would go, got it, diagonal. And I'd sit half a stride, and that's important. I'd sit half a stride and then post again. I'd be on the correct diagonal. And I got, not being a little rebellious, and having come out of a long 20 years of intense training with a master, and two masters, and one of them was really good at fixing the problem after it started. The other one was really good at fixing it before it ever started. So having that in my history, I asked my instructor, you always tell me when I'm on the wrong diagonal, but you never tell me how to get the correct diagonal to start with. It just seemed like chance. It was a 50-50 chance that I may or may not get it. So that caused me to realize, or to look into it, and it's like, if I post off the lifting inside sit bone or the pushing inside hind, I will always be on the correct diagonal. Now, that's assuming that I've done the work to expand my awareness, heighten my awareness, my feel and sensitivity, which we can train in very quickly to feel that inside sit bone. So that's the timing of the rise of that inside sit bone. And when I do that, I don't have to hurry up. Usually in rising trot, the rider has to, because we're using bigger muscles, basically the quads and the gluteus and the calves to push us into trot. We have to post quickly and sit slowly, right? And in the sitting period, we're sitting slowly and very held, so we don't sit heavy on the horse's back. That was my experience. Don't sit hard on that horse's back. Sit slow. And the biomechanics of the body, when you're sitting, the angle that the pelvis is in, because the angle in the lower back causes us to lose control of our body for the last 4 inches of sitting. And that's where we really tighten up so we don't fall back to the saddle. And we'll look at, in the next couple steps, how to change the biomechanics of the seat to allow that sitting to be very soft, very solid, right? Very heavy, if you will, which I know that sounds counterintuitive, that we want to sit heavy, but we want to sit completely so the horse can feel us, deal with our weight, and then lift us back out. Otherwise, we're just kind of posting up and down on the back of the horse over the energy of the horse rather than receiving it. So we talked a little bit about the rising period and the sitting period in the posting trot. I'd like to talk about the time that you're actually in the saddle and the time that you're in that suspension. Just to review the timing in the rising trot, there's 4 periods of time. There's the time you're in the saddle, and the time you're in suspension. Those two should be equal. There's the time you are rising out of the saddle to the height of suspension, and the time you are coming out of suspension, going back to the saddle. Those two time periods should be equal. And you'll be able to, and our listeners will be able to watch for that timing. And it's a beautiful way to start to change our perception. We go, wow, let me just look at the timing. And all of a sudden, when you look at it in four separate pieces, you go, wow, that person is just banging into the post, almost slow motion as they sit. And then when they sit, they're almost not in the saddle for only a millisecond. And then they have to bang out of the sitting to keep up with the posting. And instead of having a moment of suspension at the height of the post, it's like, now I'm all trying. What it really feels like to me is like when you throw a wet towel against the wall, hits the wall, splats, and slides down a little bit. Now that is a really horrible visual to put out there, but that's how I see it in comparison to when you float up to the height of the post and there's that moment of suspension and then you come down. So if our listeners could start to look at just the timing, separate from everything else, separate from the movement of the horse, separate of the overall position, if you will, and just if they can see those four time periods, that's going to give us a lot of information that we'll now take into the second piece that we're going to talk about in the rising trot, and that's the position. So the position of the rider's body, more importantly, the position, definition, and use of the rider's seat. Yeah, because we all know seat is everything in dressage. In fact, it should be everything in every discipline of riding, but our seat is everything. And sometimes that's as far as we get. All A's should come from the seat and the back, which I read in, I think it was Xenophon or Podolsky's book or some famous dressage master. But then when I watch dressage being taught, it seems like all A's come from the hands and the legs. You know, we get very detailed instruction on how to use the hands and the legs and less detailed instruction about the seat. So we're going to define the seat from my ride from within perspective, which is this perspective from Bagua and Tai Chi that say all movement should come from the center. And we define the center of our body as our lumbar vertebrae, our pelvis, and our femur bones. So there's the biomechanics that we have to look at, the bones, not just how the muscles and tendons and ligaments move the bones, but what the bones actually do, where the force comes, because force we're trying to receive and redirect comes through our seat first. It comes into our sit bones, permeates our pelvis. Some of it comes up through the sacrum into the lumbar. Some of it goes down each femur bone. Because this force then becomes the animating movement of the rider's seat, right? It's the power that's moving the seat. And we don't have to use our bigger muscles, our gluteus, our core muscles, our abdomen muscles, our thigh muscles, to leverage against the back of the horse and move our seat. We've allowed the horse to move our bones, so we can then use the smaller muscles, the much, much deeper muscles in our body, and those are the ones that most of us need help identifying in movement, like so the movement comes from these little muscles. So we use those small muscles to move the bones, which are carrying the force of the horse already, and they influence that power. So I'm sorry for that little rant, but I thought it was
it's wonderful. You know, the very basis of the dressage training pyramid is rhythm. I mean, it's the basis for everything. And while it does sound like, you know, we're going back to basics, it is true. Without that foundation, none of the rest of it, the suppleness, the contact, the impulsion, straightness, collection, none of that's going to happen without first first being aware of and in rhythm with your horse and helping the horse create a rhythm. So it's fascinating to me how we don't, we assume that we are feeling it because if we allow the horse to push us up. But what you're saying is there's a whole nother level to this that's more than just that throwing of a person up in the air because there's a bounce in the saddle because of the trot. So it's absolutely fascinating. So continue on. Sorry.
That's fantastic. And when you were talking, I had this picture of a metronome, right? And I've been in schools in Europe and European influenced schools here in the States where they actually still have a metronome sitting in the arena, for the case to set the, to set the rhythm. We are looking for the springs and the energy that's actually moving the metronome, right? It's way beyond that kind of 1, 2, 1, 2. Not beyond, but it's what's underneath that. So yeah, it's completely. Well, as you can tell, I love this work and I'm fascinated by it at the same time, and it keeps me. Horses in this work keep me quite humble, I hope. So we'll look. What I'd like to look at is the position, and basically we're talking about the seat when I'm looking at the position, because so much of what happens in a rider's body out beyond the seat, meaning from the knees down and from the lumbar up. So that's the thoracic vertebrae, the chest, the head, the arms, the hands, the feet, the lower legs, happen because of what is or isn't happening in the seat. So, in other words, if we just look at the upright position of the upper body, or the movement of the hands, or the stillness of the hands, or the angle at the ankle, without really understanding the depth of what's coming from the seat, then we're just treating symptoms. Usually we're treating a symptom of the seat when we deal with the hands, or we deal with the head, or the chest, or the feet. So dealing with the seat, although it takes more skill, and it takes more time, which means it takes patience, which means we have to kind of control what we think and control our emotion around it a little bit. The results are fantastic. They are immediate. When we change, the horse changes immediately. So the results are nearly magical, if not just wonderful to experience. So we'll look at the position. And in the position, we'll look at the function of each one of these 3 bone structures of the seat. That is the pelvis, which includes the sit bones, the lower lumbar, which is your lower back, and the femur bone, which is your upper leg bone, your thigh bone. Let's just start with the sit bones. In the rising trot, the inside sit bone, again, now we're painting this picture that we're on a 20-meter circle at the trot, at the rising trot. So 20-meter circle, left rein. So we're moving to the left. The inside sit bone, or the rider's left sit bone, should land in the saddle first, a millisecond, just literally probably 1 or 2 hundredths of a second before the outside sit bone lands, right? So the inside sit bone lands first and leaves first. The inside sit bone lands, the outside sit bone lands. In the next moment, the inside sit bone receives the power from the inside hind, and that starts to lift it out of the saddle before the power of the outside hind, or the right hind, gets to the saddle, right? Because that power, the inside hind, lifts us into the post. The power of the outside hind travels forward through the horse's spine as we're posting, or as we're at the height of the post. So we're not connected to it through our sit bone. So I hope that's now some of my friends who are very accomplished upper level riders do this naturally. A small percentage of them do, and of that small percentage, they were not aware of it until I asked them to feel. which sit bone lands first. Does one or the other sit bones land first? So that's expanding our awareness, right, of what's happening. So we can first become aware of what's happening in the sit bone. You'll find out that most riders, the sit bones land about the same time. They both land at the same time. And this would be fantastic if you're riding a kangaroo, right? If dressage got incorporated into kangaroo riding, because kangaroos hop. And so they push off the ground with both hind feet at the same time. So that force would come equally through their pelvis and their spine and lift both your sit bones at the same time. But we're not riding kangaroos. We're riding horses that have a bilateral move, a left-right movement from the hind. So we post off the inside hind, which the power of the inside hind, which means one sit bone, the inside leaves first, and it lands first. So that would be something for our listeners to just become aware of. See if you can sit long enough to feel if the sit bone lands first on the lead sit bone, right? Left lead, inside sit bone. Leaves first and lands first. So
that's really interesting. I'm trying to imagine it, and you do kind of just assume it's both at the same time. I want to go out and get on my horse. I want to go feel this. It's interesting.
Will, and then you'll have to come back and tell us how it went.
I will.
Now, if we think of this, earlier I said when I was describing the bigger picture of Ride from Within, learning to receive and redirect force so that we don't have to become bigger, faster, and stronger than the force we're dealing with to manage it, that we first have to let go of some old ideas, some old tensions, some things that we might not have been aware of. Having said that, because those old things, they actually block that force from coming up into us. So this is fascinating. When you start sitting inside-outside sit bone, right? Inside lands first, outside then lands, inside leaves first, outside follows. When you sit that way, you're not blocking the push of the outside hind. In other words, when you sit on both sit bones at the same time, your body and your weight, especially because the angle of the pelvis coming back to the saddle in that last half of the motion of sitting, you're actually pushing back against the haunches. And so we see that sitting that way, both sit bones at the same time with the angle of the pelvis wrong, which we'll talk about in the next moment, that pushes the hind feet out behind the tail. It leaves the hind feet back as it blocks that force from coming up. So it opposes throughness in the horse's lumbar.
My gosh. And that shows up in everything.
Everything, yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to and again, I say it's wonderful, and I know that I have friends when I introduce that, they kind of turn white and go, oh, my God.
That's what I feel. I feel white because I'm thinking I've never, all the years I've been riding, like 40-some years, I've never had it explained that way, and I'm thinking I'll bet that's why that throughness is such a hard thing to find. Could it be that simple? Could it really be that simple an answer?
Let's say that's 1/3 of a very simple answer. So we've looked at sit bones. Again, just to make it clear, inside sit bone lands first, then outside sit bone lands. In the next moment, you're leaving the saddle, the inside leaves first, and the outside follows. Okay? Mm-hmm. So we're going to look now at the use of the pelvis, like how we use our pelvis. Now, the human pelvis, along and equally for the equine pelvis, is this amazing structure. The human pelvis can move 3 directions at one time. 3 directions are based on the 3 Euclidean planes of force that the human pelvis, the actual structure, not the joints, the structure of the pelvis creates these 3 Euclidean planes of force. So if you don't know what Euclidean planes of force are, Google it, look it up, do some research. So these 3 Euclidean planes, along with the 3 bone structures, the femur bones, the pelvis, including the sacrum and the lower back, allow for these 3 separate movements that become one in the human center or the rider's body. One of the movements is the ability to turn your pelvis left and right off a vertical axis that comes right down the center of the body, behind your guts, probably just in front of the 4th and 5th lumbar vertebrae. And that means, because of that, we can pivot our belly button, if you will. We can turn our belly button left and right without shifting our weight left to right, front to back, without pushing our hips left, right, left, right. In other words, if you had, little markers right at your hip without pushing the weight aid, which is important, left or right, and without pushing the hip out left or right. So that one's a little difficult to explain on the radio, but you could feel it where you can just turn your waist to the left or right in the rising trot. And in fact, most teaching of the seat, right, when you learn how to ride, most of us get taught to be still, to hold still in the saddle. Mm-hmm. Don't move the seat, right? Now, to don't move the seat, to achieve that, means we kind of have to tighten up. And we're tightening up with the bigger muscles in our body to keep our balance. I don't want to go too much into it because it's a whole series. It's a whole symposium on the difference of keeping your balance and being balanced. So in the saddle, we want this movement in there, and that is that the belly button turns rhythmically left-right. It doesn't mean that the hips push side to side, which will move the haunches side to side. It doesn't mean that we drop our weight off each side, which will twist the barrel to each side. It's just a little vertical turning left-right. Now, what this has to do with rising trot. As we pose, as we're rising, we want the belly button or the pelvis to turn slightly in place to the outside. As we sit, the belly button or the pelvis turns to the ear. So to simplify it, outside ear as you rise, inside ear as you sit. Now, this little rotation, in the pelvis directs the inside sit bone and to land in the saddle first. And I mean this with no drama and all the sincerity that I can muster, that this is a genius design of the human pelvis. It is absolute genius that when we incorporate this little left-right movement, when you pose to the outside ear and when you sit to the inside ear, it takes care of landing on the inside sit bone first, the outside sit bone next, and leaving with the inside sit bone first.
I'm picturing this as I'm sitting here in my chair, and I can almost feel that yes, just that thinking of pointing your belly button at the ear. It does lift that inside first. That is very interesting. Yeah, I can feel that.
So in remembering that it's not the power, when we are not lifting ourselves into the pose, we are sitting a millisecond longer so that we actually let the horse's back lift us into the pose. And back is not, that's kind of a misleading. It's the power of the inside hind traveling through the skeleton, right, through their spine, that lifts our sit bone. So this turning of the pelvis to the outside as we pose, the inside as, that's the use That's what we do with the pelvis. We let the belly button turn to the outside ear as we post, the inside ear as we sit. Now, we're not, and this is a caution because so much of my work exposes what we do when we don't do this, if that makes sense. When we don't use internal principles and we don't develop the ability, we'll start to use like old tools to build a new structure, right? And that's the most efficient way. So we have to be careful that when we post, we are not posting to the outside ear, meaning that the center, your seat as a whole, isn't going from the saddle to the outside on an angle and then back to the saddle on an angle. Does that make sense? So we're not posting. It takes the power that came into your body inside sit bone and is traveling through your body just the same way that power continues to travel forward through the horse's spine, right? Because that power came from the horse. We got a little bit of it, and it's traveling up our spine. As you turn your pelvis, it changes how that power travels up to your chest, and it allows it to go up more than forward. So you will see this in the rider's seat, is that they're starting to post up on a big, like on an arc, rather than forward on an angle, because most of us need to see it in slow motion first to train our eyes to see the subtle differences. But what's not subtle is this difference in the horse's back. So as the rider is turning their belly button to the outside ear as they post and the inside ear as they sit, they will start to feel a change in the suppleness of the horse's haunches because it frees up the lower back of the horse when we do this, because we're removing the blocks that we get by sitting the same as both sit bones.
And I think that's what I saw so quickly when I first watched you at the expo with a brand new rider, someone you didn't know, and within minutes just unblocked the back, stopped blocking the back. I guess the horse isn't blocked himself, but we tend to block their back and not know we're doing it. And I remember seeing the horse just free up in minutes. It was, I know this has taken a while to explain, but when you're actually working with a rider and able to get them to move in this way, I have to tell our listeners, I saw a difference in minutes. And I thought, what the heck am I seeing? That's why I couldn't leave. I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I just know I saw a difference in the horse and how free they moved and how both the horse and rider just seemed so much more relaxed and in rhythm. I mean, the whole thing, it was just incredible. So seeing this on video will be a big help, and that's ridefromwithin.com, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of links on there to see this kind of thing, but absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely, and we will look on that first online course that I get to do. We will go into great detail visually and with video on these functions of the center. So thank you for that. It is quite fascinating to see the horse change in its haunches and its back without involving the rider's leg or hands at all. Notice we haven't talked, and we won't talk about what to do with the leg, other than the next piece of the seat is the femur bone. That's your thigh bone, your hip joint, right? The leg side of your hip joint. And so I want to talk about now what to do with the femur bones, because if you think about the rising trot, and we accept that the seat, the rider's center, is the femur bones, the pelvis, and the lower lumbar. When you're in the rising portion of the trot, when you're in the suspension portion of the trot, and you're in the sitting portion of the trot, in other words, all the time you're not sitting in the saddle in the rising trot, the only part of your seat that's still in contact with the horse is the bottom of the femur bone, the thigh bone, as it applies to the saddle. So it's very important, and this is another little bit of magic. Turning the belly button to the outside ear and as we post and the inside ear as we sit. Pretty amazing results in the horse. The rotation of the femur bone is equally amazing. So most of us have no idea, no awareness of what the femur bone does functionally in the rising trot. If you observe the femur bone in the rising trot, most riders, their femur bones rotate inward as they pose and outward as they sit. And what that means is there's an internal rotation in the femur head, the ball and socket joint of the hip. There's an internal rotation as we pose, and there's an external rotation in the femur head as we sit. Now, the best place for our listeners to look for this is in the seam of the breeches in the rider's upper leg, right? Most breeches have a nice straight seam from the right, kind of mirrors the femur bone. From right down the leg, there's an outside seam. And if you watch that seam, you'll see that it kind of rolls inward as the rider's pose, and it rolls out and you sit. We want the opposite to happen. We want to rotate in as we sit and out as we pose. Now I'm going to go right into why biomechanically this is so much better than rolling out when you sit and in when you pose. When you roll in, the femur's in when you sit, it changes through the hip joint, through the gemellus and the obturator muscle. It changes the angle of the pelvis, and it opens, that changing of the angle of the pelvis, opens the curve in the lower back, which allows the rider to sit more down than sit back, right? So rolling in on the femur opens the lower back so that we're actually sitting down, and in sitting down, we are controlled through the whole time from the height of the post to when that inside sit bone first meets the saddle. If you roll out when you sit, the last 4 inches of your sitting, you're free falling. It doesn't matter if you're a world-class World Cup rider, Olympian, those last 4 inches of your descent to the saddle is a free fall, right? Meaning that gravity has taken over your skeleton, and you are going to fall, you are going to sit no matter what. The only thing that we do to compensate that kind of falling to the saddle is we tighten up in the back and we tighten up in the thighs and we sit lightly, right? We have to control it. And that tension and that tightening immediately shows up in the horse. And tightening in the back tightens their back, tightening in the thighs tightens their ability to open the back and lift the leg, so they have to swing it harder using bigger muscles. It's not a pretty picture, although we might not see it like that. So this rotation of the femur, that it can rotate in and it can rotate out without the leg swinging, right? It's separate from the kind of hinged movement or the swing of the leg. This movement, rotating in and out, it's brilliantly practiced on the ground. So that's what I want our listeners to do, is to practice this on the ground. So what you would do is get a chair, and you'd stand in front of a chair. Now, a stool that's maybe, a stool or a chair. You don't want a really tiny, low chair because you'll have to fall backwards. But if you get a chair, like there's a stool behind you, and you go to sit down, most of us will feel that as we sit, we bend our knees, our back arches, and our butt actually pushes back. And then the last few inches, as we're coming to the chair, we actually kind of fall back to the chair, right? And we know it's there, so we don't panic, and we kind of fall. If you rotate your femur bones in as you sit, you will feel that you are sitting down and not back. And the most important thing is that inward rotation of the femur head or the ball in the socket allows you to control your sitting all the way down, so you can feel your inside sit bone land and your outside sit bone land. So again, this is really important. In the rising trot, we want the femurs to rotate in when we sit. That mechanically in the joint sets the femoral tendon up like a spring, so that when the horse lifts us up, they roll out. The femur bones almost spring out, which lifts and moves the pelvis forward. So it's fascinating to just look at the bone structure, how this works, but we don't have bones to look at. We can only see a picture in our mind's eye now. But so as you sit, we want the femurs to rotate in, and they'll naturally roll out as you pose. Practice this in a chair, first to see if you can feel a difference. Go out to the barn. Watch somebody in rising trot, because you can't see it in yourself. Watch somebody in rising trot. Watch the seam in their breeches. See that it rolls in, right? It rolls in as they pose. This is the opposite of the highest function of our seat. We want it to roll in when we sit and out when we pose. This alone is mind-blowing in the saddle. The changes that happen are phenomenal.
And I'm imagining doing this while I'm sitting here in the chair, but also thinking about people I've known that we would say have just a natural seat, and I'm wondering if this is the difference, if they naturally just started out this way, in the way you suggest, and so to us it's like, oh, well, they just magically did that, they were born with that. But if it's something, a skill that you can actually retrain your muscle memory to do, maybe it's not so magical after all. It's something we can actually learn.
You can learn it, and I think it is magical. It is absolutely magical. And I would put out there, the best thing that our listeners can do is to observe as many riders on video or live and in person as they can, and look at the movement, which is inside the muscle, right? It's not the up and down movement of the thigh or the femur bone. It's what's happening within the bigger movement, rotation in there. And I have never seen somebody that, well, not never. I've seen one that rotates in when they sit, and they didn't know that they were rotating in when they sit. But they also have a couple gold medals in their tack room somewhere or on the wall. But
one of those natural seats, right? They just didn't realize that they naturally learned it the right way.
Yeah, they did it. So the reason I said that is because so many of us, because we've tried so hard, think, oh, I must do that. And within that thought, oh, I must do that, we sometimes then forget to check it out. Mm-hmm. And even if you do it, even if you're already rotating the femurs in when you sit and out when you pose, you can refine it, right? We can refine it and become better at it. So I just don't want to miss the opportunity to help people refine their movements. Most of us will find we don't do that. I have not worked with a rider in the probably 1,000 clinics that I've done that naturally rotates in. But having said that, everyone that gets then taught through awareness and timing to rotate in, can do it. They magically do it. Now, they have to remember to do it, but it happens. It's not something that you have to create superhuman ability to do. It's absolutely designed into the genius structure of our human center.
Okay.
So in the position, talking about the position, which is talking about the seat, your center. There's 3 bone structures in your seat: the femur bone, the pelvis, and the lumbar, including the sacrum. So as far as the pelvis is concerned, we pose belly button to the outside ear, belly button to the inside ear as we sit. Now, there's a little more to it than that, but we don't have time to go into it, but it's in there. I'm sure our listeners will feel that. Outside ear as we sit, post, inside ear as we sit. So that's the pelvis. The femur bones. We want to rotate the femur bones in as we sit so that they can naturally roll out as we pose. Most of us do the opposite. We lean forward, we arch the back, we push with the thighs, the knees come out, and the femur bones roll out when we pose. We don't want to do that. As we lean forward, we weight the withers of the horse. As we arch our back, we create a block in the lower lumbar of the horse's back. As we push off and we hit the height of our pose, all our weight drops through the front of the saddle onto the withers. That's what happens when you roll out on the way down and in on the way up. We want to change that. We want to roll in, meaning we roll our femurs, and both femurs roll the same direction. They both roll in when we sit, and they both roll out when we pose. So that's the three functions in the three bones of our seat. Now, and again, your callers can send me emails with questions. They can send me video. I'm completely available to anyone who wants to discuss this or wants some clarification. So I'll put that out there before we end, and then we'll give you information to contact me if you need to or would like to after we're done. So let's look at these three functions of the seat at the sitting trot. Now, the sitting trot, we'll think about the belly button or the pelvis movement at the sitting trot. Most of us learn to sit up straight, sit back a little bit, drive forward with the seat, and that means that the pelvis is only moving two directions out of the three possible directions of movement. That means the sit bones are being lifted left, right, and the lower back is bending, bend, and it allows the pelvis to kind of pivot on the femur head a little bit on the hip joint so that the weight rocks back and forth, right? And you can watch it, you can see it, that the sit bones, the pressure in the sit bones goes front to back. They're like little rockers. The weight rocks forward and back depending on the rise and the fall of the sit bone. So that kind of only doing those two movements at the sitting trot creates a tremendous block in the lower back. And that's apparent throughout dressage and in general, actually. But many upper level riders, famous, everybody knows their names, have serious back issues, right? Back issues that get in the way of their riding. And those back issues comes from this two-dimensional movement of the seat, side to side, up and down in the sit bone, left, right, and front to back on the sit bone. As you add the belly button movement in to the sitting trot, and that is that your belly button should turn left, right, within its center, right? In other words, you can turn the belly button towards the rising sit bones. And remember, the sit bones lift every time a horse pushes into the earth. So he pushes in left hind, left sit bone lifts. He pushes into the earth, right hind, right sit bone lift. So your sit bones become your metronome, right? Through your sit bones, you can know exactly where the hind feet are in the gait. One of the laws is that the bigger, stronger force always sets the rhythm. The bigger, stronger force sets the rhythm. So the horse sets the rhythm. The horse's hind feet are the powerhouse. They create the rhythm. So in our sit bones, we can feel the rhythm of the horse by the rise and fall of our sit bones. Then we can turn our belly button left, right, in the sitting trot. Now, it's not a very big movement. It's a really small movement. It's created by the gemellus and the obturator muscles, which basically means you're pulling your belly button to the left from your left hip in the front of the left hip in the groin crease, and you're pulling the belly button to the right in the groin crease of the right side. When you add this third movement in, it takes those two big waves of force that come up your back in the sitting trot and kind of turns them into a spiral so it's easier to sit. It also changes how the force comes out of the horse's sacrum forward through its spine, so it actually gets to lift in its lumbar. It gets to lift from above in its back rather than to push the back up from underneath. Now,
Trying to picture this. I'm looking forward to the videos on your website to see if I can see this.
And you will, there's dramatic change in the horse when you do it. For as complicated as it is to explain, it's simple to do. Femur bones always move opposite each other, meaning the left femur rolls in as the left sit bone gets lifted, the right femur rolls out as the right sit bone drops, right? Because your sit bones, again, one lifts and one drops, one lifts and one drops. The femur bone rolls in when the sit bone lifts, and it rolls out for an outward rotation when it drops. It is the same thing in the horse. So we mirror what the horse is doing in our femur bones. Now, at the sitting trot, there's way too much going on to have to worry about the sit bone, the rotation of the humerus bones. They will naturally rotate the way they're supposed to when the belly button starts turning.
Mm-hmm.
If you turn your pelvis, your belly button, towards the dropping sit bone, right, the leg that's stepping forward in the air, you will create tension in the horse's spine. Not just in the step of the leg or the reach of the fore, but you will create actual leg spine, and it's most clearly seen in the neck. As that horse comes forward through the spine, comes out of the withers, you actually see the neck not just dropping or reaching down, because that doesn't mean it's lengthening. You actually see, where I see it in the mane. The mane starts to look like a spring that opens. So you create collection, turning to the lifting sit bone, into the lifting sit bone, which is really into the lifting energy of the horse into your body. And you create extension by turning into the dropping sit bone. Having said that, this is probably practice developed and felt at walk. At sitting trot, there's way too much going on. It'll consume your mind just seeing belly button left, right. Now, next piece that we want to look at is the lower back, the curve of the lower lumbar. Most of us have to arch. We sit up straight and we lift our sternum, arches our lower back, and it puts us back on our sit bones a little bit. And that overarches our lower lumbar, the sitting trot, and it causes issues in the rider's back, as well as, and this is a big thing, issues in the horse's lumbar. It creates a block in the horse's lumbar, so that power that's traveling through the skeleton of the leg, right, the lower limbs, not the hind limbs, into the spine, it hits the lower back, and that force actually bounces through the joint. And I am sure, while it's not scientifically proved, it's proved through experience that block in the horse's lumbar creates issues in the horse's hocks and stifle. And it is a huge, huge problem in the industry. Not that I want to get on that bandwagon, but that block at the lower back causes issues in the hocks and stifle, and nobody seems to recognize it. So by the rider opening their lower back a little bit, taking some of the curve out of the lumbar, which happens when we start to turn the pelvis correctly, it allows the back to open up a little bit. It frees up the horse's back because it frees up their lumbar vertebrae. And then that power, the power that creates throughness, that should create collection, gets to flow not only through the horse's back differently, but up the rider's spine differently. I know it's a lot of information.
Well, and I know that you have a lot of this information on your website, ridefromwithin.com, and I'm looking forward to seeing the videos on there to go with these concepts. I think that will be a big help. And I know you do teach clinics all over the country, all over the world. I know you spent some time in Europe, England as well. So it's fascinating work, and such a foundational thing for any kind of riding, any kind of level. It doesn't matter if you're a Grand Prix rider or you're just starting out learning some new ways just to move your own body to go with the horse. It saves your own back, saves your horse's back, hocks and stifles, as you said, and absolutely powerful foundational work for anything that you do. So I very much appreciate you being with us today and sharing all this with us.
It is a great pleasure, my great pleasure to share this, and we'll continue the work. That's all I've got on my plate for the next 50 years is getting this work out there.
Well, I love it. I love it. And for our listeners, again, this is James Shaw at ridefromwithin.com. He does have a book and DVDs available, which I'm sure are available on your website. Do go take a peek and watch for him at your local expos. And if you would like to have James come teach a clinic in your area, I'm sure you can reach him by his website as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I love meeting new friends and planting seeds.
Well, thanks again for joining us today, James, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on James Savoy's Interviews with the Experts. I am your host, Chris Garrett. We'll talk to you again next time. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.